Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're doing the Sabaton history for the Battle of Kursk. Like I've said in the last couple of videos, I have a bunch of stuff that I'm working on for the channel. Y'all bear with me a little bit. Today, this will be the only video and I won't be working really the rest of the day. In the US today is Super Bowl Sunday, which is our football league's championship game. Like football, not the European football, American football. So I won't be here for most of the day. I have other stuff that I'm going to do. But I'll be back at it tomorrow, working on everything and getting the movie out for The Big Short. But yeah, today we'll start with Sabaton history, the Battle of Kursk. Per and Indy, let's get into it.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Per from Sabaton, and this is Sabaton History.
One of the largest tank battles in history, in 1943 in World War II, resulted in the Soviet Union gaining the initiative on the Eastern Front, which it would hold until the end of the war.
And our song Panzerkampf became one of the most unexpected Sabaton popular songs we ever did.
Into the motherland, the German army march.
The Panzerkampf was fought between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, and here's the story behind it.
The Russian counteroffensives that had begun in November 1942 had pushed the Germans not only mostly out of the Caucasus, but also crossed into eastern Ukraine and southern Belarus. By March 1943, they had created a large salient deep into the German front lines between the cities of Orel and Kharkov. This was the Kursk salient and was an obvious target for German high command. By cutting off the salient, they would not only shorten the front line, but also trap a large amount of Russian soldiers and material. Such a success.
Yeah, but here's the deal. We've already done the video on Blau, right? You had to get to the oil. If you were going to do an attack on the Soviet Union, you had to get to the freaking oil. Because if you didn't, you were going to die a slow death. Like, even if you could hold on, you would constantly be bleeding from that point on. And so, yeah, it would have been cool. Cut off the salient, trap all the soldiers, you have this giant pocket. But let's be honest, how many giant pockets did they take on their initial Barbarossa invasion? Like, how many encircling movements did they have that took just hundreds of thousands of Red Army POWs in each one? Russia's just got too much shit. Like, they got too much stuff. They got too many people. They got too much land. They got too many factories. Like, they have too much stuff, right? And so it would take a very unique strategy to conquer the Soviet Union. Even in the modern day, to conquer Russia would take a very unique, out-of-the-box strategy. But certainly at this time period, like, you need something out of the box. Big offenses, and it doesn't matter. It never mattered how many prisoners you took. They just kept coming back.
Success would give the Germans time to rebuild after the recent losses at Stalingrad. Both the forces of Army Group South, led by Generalfeldmarschall Erich von Manstein, and those of Army Group North under Generaloberst Walter Model were to perform a massive pincer movement that would smash through on both sides of the salient and encircle the troops inside. But many German generals expressed doubts. See, the Russian army of 1943 was not the same army they so easily outmaneuvered in 1941. By now, the Soviets were much more competent in using their deep battle doctrine, and they were already preparing a summer offensive to use the salient to their own advantage, since they also knew of the German plans. The British had cracked the German ciphers and given intel to the Soviets, so Stavka, Russian High Command, had convinced Stalin to delay the Soviet offensive until after the Germans had exhausted.
I've talked to you about this, especially in the Winter War series. I have my issues with Stavka during this time period, but they're pretty on it when it comes to the front with Germany, particularly later on. And yeah, once they have, because here's the deal, at this time period, they're begging the Western powers to open a second front, right? Open a second front, please. It's been, year after year now where they're just like, God, open a second front. Well, on the lead up to opening that second front, when the West really didn't want to open a Western front in Europe, they were giving the Soviets everything else they could, right? Materials, money, war supplies, intel, like it said with the breaking the code machines, everything they could to try to help and satiate the Soviets to keep them from actually having to open that front in Western Europe.
Exhausted their own against the Russian defenses. Then the Soviet counteroffensive would easily punch through the German lines and collapse the whole army group center.
The Soviet Union, summer 1943. Tanks line up in thousands, as far as I can see. Ready for the onslaught, ready for the fight. Waiting for the access to march into the trap.
So, tens of thousands of Russian workers began building an enormous defense-in-depth system, digging trenches and tank traps on 5,000 kilometers of front line. The defense was centered mostly on strong points manned by rifle battalions. Each also had 4.5-centimeter anti-tank guns. Russian pioneers lay up to 1 million mines all around the salient, both anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, mostly in front of their forward line. Red Army General Konstantin Rokossovsky had also a strong mobile defense force that would engage the Germans if they managed to penetrate the front lines. All in all,
this sounds like what the Germans did late in World War I. Like, so the Germans' doctrine changed whenever Ludendorff got in control of basically the government. Ludendorff basically became like a military dictator for Germany at the end of World War I. But this is basically the strategy he had. Obviously, anti-tank mines not really a thing, but for the defense in depth and the defensive works and traps and having reserves back, where if you have if people coming on the offensive make it through a certain level of the defense, you have kind of more resistance from these reserve troops as they get deeper and deeper in. It's really kind of a clever strategy. Now, they do it for different ends, right? Like, this is really a trap for the Germans that the Russians are laying here, or that the Soviets are laying here. The Germans in World War I, that was much more of a, like, grand philosophy of how to win the war. And the thought process was, we'll give up land for casualties, right? Like, that was Ludendorff's war strategy. So a little bit different in the kind of what they're trying to do overall, but very similar strategies here.
the Soviet forces enjoyed at least a 2-to-1 advantage in men, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Von Manstein disregarded those numbers since he still believed in the inferior quality of the Soviet troops. Model was less optimistic and very much against the whole operation, but despite his doubts, Adolf Hitler and German High Command urged him to concentrate all his forces and attack from the north. Model, however, prepared for a possible Russian counterattack and held the 2nd Panzer Armee around the city of Orel in reserve. He also prepared the Hagenstellung, a defensive line the Germans could fall back on if everything went to hell. On July 5th, 1943, the German offensive began. Okay, it actually began with a Soviet artillery barrage that rained down on the German front lines. See,
yeah, that's not a great sign, right? If you're the Germans in this situation and some of the generals kind of have this idea that, like, we may be walking into a very dangerous situation here. If the Soviets are the ones who start it, that would be the first red flag for me of, like, okay, maybe they're a little more prepared and expecting what's coming.
the day before, captured German soldiers had revealed the exact hour the offensive would begin, so tactical surprise was lost. Still, the German forces were soon moving toward the Russian lines under their own opening barrage of heavy artillery, mortars, and Nebelwerfer rockets. As usual, the advance was spearheaded by the German tank divisions and mobile Sturm divisions, but the minefields and the Soviet resistance slowed them down. However, the Germans had sent new weapon systems into the battle. Ferdinand tank destroyers could outrange their Russian counterparts, and German pioneers led radio-controlled demolition tanks into the minefields to clear the path. Well-positioned Tiger tanks could destroy whole groups of Russian tanks that were sent out in premature counterattacks. In the air, the superior German FW-190As were able to suppress the Russian fighter and bomber attacks despite their disadvantage in numbers. So, as the days dragged on, the German advance took out several major strongpoints, and they even penetrated the first line of Rokossovsky's defenses. But the large defensive system slowly but steadily whittled away the German forces. Tanks were damaged by the mines, and the relentless Russian artillery caused heavy casualties among the German infantry. German tank losses weren't actually as high as Russian sources may suggest. Only around 10% of Model's tanks were lost, for example. The others took light damage, mostly to their tracks, which could usually be repaired in the field. Nonetheless, the Soviets achieved what they hoped for. They blunted the German spear, all while the Russian tank armies were building up for their own killing blow. On the 11th of August, Model finally called off the fruitless offensive. Only the elite SS Panzer divisions Totenkopf, Das Reich, and Leibstandarte in the south were still making progress as they reached the fields near a small village called Prokhorovka. The Stavka wanted to attack now, before Model could redeploy his panzers. The long-awaited counterattack, Operation Kutuzov, would set loose the Russian tank armies. Early in the morning of the 12th, Operation Kutuzov began.
Reinforce the front line, force the Axis to retreat, sending all the reserves, securing their defeat. Soldiers of the Union broke the citadel, ruined Soviet army, Axis rest in hell.
In the south, those SS Panzer divisions were surprised by a wave of armor that was heading their way. Some 500 tanks that attacked the unprepared Germans. The backbone of the Russian tank force was the upgraded T-34-76 model, which made around 70% of the tanks. But most of the rest was made out of light tanks. Only a few heavy KV tanks were there. The Germans had far fewer tanks, not even 300, but those SS divisions were the first to receive the Tiger and Panther models that outclassed the T-34 in range and whose armor could not be penetrated by the lighter tanks. And yet, in larger groups, the T-34 was still extremely dangerous. The tanks clashed on the fields of Prokhorovka. The German tanks desperately fought off the Soviet tanks at point-blank range. German panzer grenadiers even resorted to ramming them with their half-tracks. Despite heavy losses, though, the Soviets forced the Germans to retreat.
That is the tank battles and all of the information on the upgrades to the tanks, because all of the sides in this war are adding, layers of thickness for the armor so that, certain older models of enemy tanks can't pierce the armor. You have them adding different guns. You just have all of these ideas. And so tanks at this time period, particularly for Germany and the Soviet Union, they're moving really fast, right? The changes to the tanks are moving really fast. And that's such an interesting study to me. To see, what did they come up with when they realized they were going up against a tank that had armor plating that was this thick. What was their answer to that? Once they put on a gun that was that big, what was the answer to that? This back and forth is super interesting to me. But the Soviets here have basically just the overwhelming manpower advantage, right? They have way more tanks, way more at this particular moment. And so, you can make up for a lot of issues with what types of tanks they are by just having sheer overwhelming amounts of them.
Heat of battle burned, suffered heavy losses, and the tide of war was turned. Driving back the Germans, fighting on for front, hunt them out of Russia, out of Soviet land.
In the north, the counteroffensive began with a massive artillery strike, obliterating much of the German forward positions of the 2nd Panzer Armee. The Soviet counterattack here would be even more deadly than in the south. Model's foresight had paid off, and the 2nd Panzer Armee was able to fend off the first wave of Russian tanks attacking towards Orel. But this was just the initial engagement. The overwhelming Russian artillery and armor soon broke into the German positions all over the front, and Model was forced to pull back just to prevent encirclement, without even waiting for authorization from Hitler. However, the Soviets failed to exploit their advantage, nor realize how close the German defenses were to collapsing. So the Germans managed a fighting retreat. As the Red Army captured the major prize of Orel on August 5th, the German army retreated into their Hagen position. And it was that which ultimately saved them. German high command was now forced to face the fact that the German army was not able to fight high-intensity battles on such a large scale any longer. The offensive had been a disaster. For not only did it not bring victory, it cost the German army the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, and they would never regain it. The offensive had cost the Russians dearly, yes, and losses were perhaps 4 times higher than those of the Germans, but the Russians could replace their losses, which the Germans...
That's the whole thing. That's why I was saying the pocket itself is not as strategically important as you would think, because the Soviets just have too much stuff. Too many people, too many tanks, just too much. They're just too much. So, I've said this a million times, did the tick video, but you had to have oil. And I would not have picked a full-scale invasion against the Soviet Union to attempt to get that oil. There may have not been any super convenient, realistic way to get it, but this would have been the last of the options I picked, is full-scale invasion against the Soviet Union.
By this time could not. The Russians were on the offensive for good.
The end of the Third Reich draws near. Its time has come to an end.
Now, Panzerkampf is from the album Art of War, but it was not one of the singles or anything, right?
No, it was very interesting that we didn't believe so much in the song Panzerkampf initially.
Okay.
And there were so many songs that we felt that were more stronger on the Art of War album. Even though this album is now over 10 years,
Yeah.
this specific song can climb to the position number 1 of all Sabaton songs.
Panzerkampf! Into the motherland, the German army march.
So why do you suppose that is? What is it about it that you think resonates with people,
I think that the song represents a lot that is Sabaton.
right?
It has a huge scale battle. Tanks, more tanks, and even more tanks, and most tanks. A lot of our fans, this is what they want to hear about. Also, it has the power, the sing-along things,
Yeah.
very powerful chorus.
Thinking even back before that, when you guys wrote the song, was it written to be a typical Sabaton song with tanks and stuff? Or was it were you specifically thinking about that battle?
We were specifically thinking about that battle because all the songs on the Art of War represents one of the chapters in the scripts.
Right.
The Art of War.
The Sabaton album, The Art of War, is named after one of the world's classic pieces of literature. It is traditionally attributed to the ancient Chinese military leader Sun Tzu, though some of it likely dates from before his time. It's roughly 2,500 years old, and though it is ancient military strategy, it is in many ways timeless and has applications beyond the military, such as in business, law, and even sports. This is because its 13 chapters do not only deal with things like waging war or incendiary attacks, but also include the use of spies, identifying weak spots, and strategic planning. Basically, winning the fight without having to engage in battle, outsmarting your opponent. It is required reading for executives at many Japanese companies, is recommended reading for all U.S. military intelligence personnel, was widely studied by the KGB, and Bill Belichick, head coach of the NFL's New England Patriots, who just won their record 6th Super Bowl under him, has used the lessons of the Art of War in his strategic preparations for football games. Again, one of the most influential texts in history.
That was Panzerkampf, chapter number 9 from the Art of War. See you next week.
On the Sabaton History Channel.
All right, everyone. Remember to subscribe to Sabaton History, the regular Sabaton channel. Check out World War II and Time Ghost as well, all right? Right here, we got a playlist. More videos like this. It's good. You want to click this. And also, remember to support us on Patreon. That's what makes things like this happen.
Okay, so that was Panzerkampf for the Battle of Kursk, Sabaton history. Yeah, the Art of War is obviously a super well-known book. I'm trying to think. There's another one that's an older book like that here that is kind of referenced in the same way. I'm blanking on it. God, I hate when I'm in the middle of doing something. Like I'm on here recording and something that I could easily think of and will think of 3 seconds after I get up. I can't for the life of me remember it. Whatever. It's Machiavelli. I'm blanking on the name of the book, but thought of sort of in the same way. But yeah, really interesting. I didn't know that was the way that they had done that album, that they had set it up by kind of like the chapters of the book. So that's really interesting. But yeah, this was another great one. Sabaton history. I'm hoping that tomorrow the Big Short movie reaction will be out. It's, over the 2008 financial crisis. And so I'll see you guys then.